You know, it's a scenario that absolutely keeps strategists up at night. A direct military conflict between the United States and Iran. But what would that actually look like? Today, we're going to deconstruct a detailed war game analysis from experts at the Brookings Institution to really understand the cascading consequences of an event like this. Okay, let's dive right in.
So this is the big question, right? It's not just about battles and military targets. A war with Iran would unleash this whole series of ripple effects, and they touch everything from global oil markets to, the very foundations of international law. We're going to break down 4 of those major ripples.
Every fire starts with a spark, and in this incredibly detailed scenario from the Brookings Institution, the conflict doesn't just begin in a vacuum. Nope, it's the culmination of escalating tensions. A fictional but totally plausible chain of events that leads to that first shot being fired. So let's take a look at the timeline.
Okay, so here's the setup the experts laid out. It all starts with major internal unrest in Iran. The US kind of senses the rising tension and starts repositioning some personnel, just as a precaution. And then, the tipping point. A joint US-Israeli military op on February 28, 2026 that results in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And just like that, the first ripple begins.
The first and most immediate impact is right inside Iran itself. I mean, taking out the supreme leader is a monumental event. The initial hope from the outside is for a total collapse, but the reality? Well, it's far, far more complex. The whole world just holds its breath, wondering what in the world comes next.
You can just imagine the initial reaction, right? Especially for anyone who opposes the regime, it's just pure elation. People are celebrating in the streets. The thinking is pretty simple. The leader is gone, so the regime must be next. This feels like the moment a popular revolution could finally succeed.
But experts like Suzanne Maloney urge some serious caution here. She points out that, look, just as the Shah's departure back in 1979 didn't lead to the democracy so many people hoped for, this one single act is really unlikely to produce some kind of simple, clean transition of power. The reality on the ground is just way more complicated than that.
And this slide just illustrates the core problem so perfectly. On one hand, you have the aspiration, the dream, a grassroots democratic revolution. But then there's the reality. And the reality is that the Islamic Republic isn't just one guy. It's a whole system built over nearly half a century with these incredibly powerful networks in the military, the economy, and religious institutions. These established powers have a massive advantage over any kind of fragmented opposition.
So what's the more likely outcome then? Well, according to analyst Sharon Gruel, it's what he calls the Venezuela scenario. Instead of a long, drawn-out war to get total regime change, the U.S. would probably just strike a deal with whoever manages to grab power next. A modified nuclear deal, maybe some oil concessions, and the core of the regime stays, just with a new face at the top.
Okay, let's move to our next ripple and see how this thing builds. Because the chaos inside Iran, it doesn't stay contained, not at all. It immediately spills across its borders, basically setting the entire Middle East on fire.
Iran's response is swift and it is furious. With its back against the wall, the regime's survival strategy is basically to inflict maximum pain on everyone else. Missiles and drones are launched at no fewer than 9 different countries. The strategy here isn't to win a conventional war, it's to attack the economic and energy infrastructure of its neighbors, creating immense pressure for some kind of diplomatic solution. And yeah, their low-cost drones prove to be chillingly effective. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what's at stake for the entire globe. This map shows something called the strategic energy ellipse. Get this, over 70% of the world's proven oil reserves are right here, in and around the Persian Gulf. A regional war puts all of this at risk, threatening to send massive shockwaves through the entire global economy.
The conflict also just fundamentally reshapes alliances. Take Turkey and Israel. Analyst Asli Aydin-Tashbash notes that Ankara, that's Turkey, doesn't see this as a U.S. war. No, they see it as an Israeli-led effort to reshape the Middle East. And this just deepens their rivalry, with each side seeing the other's gains as a direct threat. The war basically forces everyone to pick a side.
And that brings us to our third ripple. This is no longer just a regional crisis. Now, major world powers are being forced to get off the sidelines and respond.
So Europe's major powers, the E3, at first they're calling for restraint. Everyone calm down. But that changes, and it changes fast. After Iranian drones hit British and French military bases, their whole posture hardens. They commit to defending their interests, which signals a potential entry into the conflict, a move that would just dramatically widen the war.
For Russia, the reaction is pretty complex. Pavel Bayev notes that Vladimir Putin has this deep-seated paranoia about the killing of authoritarian leaders. He sees it as a personal threat. But here's the thing. Russia, bogged down in Ukraine, is largely powerless to do anything about it. Beyond some harsh words and maybe a UN resolution, Moscow has very, very limited options to actually step in and help its Iranian partner.
And what about China? Well, Ryan Haas describes Beijing's reaction as cool and pragmatic. Of course, a war that messes with the flow of oil is a setback. But it's a setback they have been expecting. By building up massive strategic petroleum reserves and finding new energy partners, China has worked really hard to insulate itself from exactly this kind of crisis in the Middle East.
For our final ripple, we're going to turn inward to the United States, because a war like this doesn't just ignite conflicts abroad, it starts a firestorm right here at home, raising these profound questions about presidential power, the Constitution, and whether the whole operation was even legal to begin with.
At the heart of the whole debate is this concept: presidential war powers. For decades, the executive branch has basically argued that it can use military force without a vote from Congress as long as the engagement isn't prolonged and substantial. But, the definition of that phrase has become dangerously elastic. As William Galston argues, launching a war of choice against a major regional power without even having a debate in Congress, that is a massive constitutional challenge. It completely sidesteps the system of checks and balances that the founders designed to stop one person from having the sole power to start a war.
So the crucial point is how they justify this. The legal argument has shifted to focus really narrowly on the risk of U.S. casualties. If an operation, even a massive air campaign, involves what they see as limited risk to American personnel, it's deemed okay. The bigger consequences, like creating a failed state or igniting a regional war, those aren't even part of the legal math.
And this leads to what is maybe the most damning critique of all. Stephanie T. Williams argues the administration is simply flying blind. The U.S. launched an illegal war against a country where it has no diplomatic presence, it decapitated its leadership, and according to these experts, it has no coherent plan at all for the chaos that will absolutely inevitably follow.
And that leaves us with this final, really critical question. The analysis suggests that an action that was intended to project American strength and, solve a problem could, through a series of pretty predictable ripples, unleash a catastrophe with no clear end in sight. It really forces us to ask not just if we can act, but if we've truly, honestly considered all the consequences of what happens next.